Robert Calloway had spent his entire life on Calloway Farm, and in all his years, he had never seen a greater insult than the one standing before him. Or rather, the one that no longer stood. His bridge, his grandfather's bridge, was gone. The creek that cut through his land had always been a minor obstacle, a shallow, winding ribbon of water that barely rose above a man's knees even after heavy rains. But the bridge had made life easier. It was the link between his farm and the county road, the connection that let him bring in supplies, drive cattle, and haul his harvest to market. It had stood for 50 years, worn smooth by time, but still strong. And now, nothing remained but splintered wood, fresh tire tracks, and the smug face of Glenn Whitmore. "Mr. Calloway," Glenn said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive polo shirt. "I assume you're here to discuss the removal?" Robert's fists clenched at his sides. The only thing keeping him from throwing a punch was the group of workers loading the last of the debris into a truck. "What the hell have you done?" His voice came out tight, measured, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. Glenn gestured toward the empty space where the bridge had once stood, as if it were a simple matter of paperwork rather than the destruction of a family's legacy. The Oak Ridge Homeowners Association voted to have it taken down. It was an unapproved structure, Robert. An eyesore. Robert could barely breathe. An eyesore? That bridge has been here longer than you've lived in this damn town. Glenn sighed, shaking his head. "It's not personal. You've been annexed into Oak Ridge jurisdiction. That means your property must comply with HOA regulations." "Annexed." Robert's voice was deadly quiet. "I never agreed to that." "Oh, but you did." Glenn's smile was pure poison. "You remember those county zoning changes last year? That little vote that you and half the folks around here ignored? Well, the HOA took an interest, and now your land falls within our oversight." Robert remembered. There had been a lot of talk at the feed store about a new development creeping toward the outskirts of town. But nobody had expected it to swallow up old farmland. He'd ignored the warnings, thinking his property, his family's land, was untouchable. Apparently, he had been wrong. "You had no right," Robert ground out. "That bridge was mine." Glenn's smile widened. "Correction. The land is yours, but structures must meet HOA standards. And that rickety old thing certainly didn't. It was a liability." Robert's blood burned hot in his veins. "A liability? You mean an inconvenience. You just don't want farmers cluttering up your precious subdivision." Glenn had the audacity to chuckle. Now. Let's not make this into some grand rebellion. It's just policy. But if you really want another bridge, you can submit an application to the board." He gave Robert a patronizing look. "Of course, you'd need to pay for HOA-approved materials. And get clearance from the Architectural Review Committee. Could take a year or two." Robert stared at him, stunned by the sheer arrogance. This wasn't just bureaucracy. This was control. Domination. Glenn clapped him on the shoulder as if they were old friends. "I understand this is upsetting, Robert. But rules are rules. If you need access to the main road, you're welcome to use the HOA-approved entrance." Robert knew exactly what that meant. The approved entrance was a 2-mile detour through Oak Ridge's pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood. He would have to drive past manicured lawns and pastel-colored homes, past residents who sneered at men like him, men with dirt under their nails and work-worn hands. He would have to ask permission to use a road that had never belonged to them in the first place. His stomach churned with disgust. Glenn Whitmore didn't just tear down a bridge today. He tore down the last shred of respect Robert had for the people who ran Oak Ridge. And in return, Robert would make sure Glenn's precious empire came crashing down. He turned without another word, fists still clenched, as he stalked back toward his truck. The battle had begun. And he intended to win. Robert Calloway had never been a man who sought conflict. He was a farmer, not a politician. A man who built things, not tore them down. But as he stood on his porch that evening, staring at the empty space where his bridge had once been, he realized something fundamental had shifted. The HOA had made a mistake. They thought he was like the others, the retirees who grumbled but paid their fines, the families who swallowed their outrage for the sake of suburban peace. They thought he would accept their authority, that he would fall in line like everyone else. They were wrong. He wouldn't fight them with fists or threats. No, that would be too easy. Too predictable. He would fight them the same way they had attacked him, with rules, with technicalities, with the cold, suffocating grip of bureaucracy. And he knew exactly where to start. The first strike. The next morning, Robert drove straight into town, his truck rumbling to a stop outside the county clerk's office. He pushed through the glass doors and walked up to the counter, where a middle-aged woman in thick glasses and a cardigan barely looked up from her paperwork. "Morning," he said. "I need to see the HOA filings for Oak Ridge." The woman sighed, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Public records request. Fill this out." Robert scribbled his information quickly. "How long will this take?" "Few days, maybe a week," she said, already looking back at her screen. Robert forced a polite smile. "I'll wait." 30 minutes later, a stack of folders landed on the desk beside him. He flipped through them methodically, scanning for anything that stood out. It didn't take long. A building permit violation. Unfiled financial reports. A miscalculated zoning change. And then, the jackpot, an overlooked county regulation buried under amendments and legalese. Glenn Whitmore's own property was in violation of multiple land use codes. His oversized backyard fountain, his decorative stone wall, even the gazebo where he held his precious HOA meetings, they were all unpermitted structures. Robert sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Perfect. Delivering the blow. 2 days later, Robert watched from the corner of Oak Ridge's pristine cul-de-sac as a county inspector knocked on Glenn Whitmore's door. From his vantage point, he could see Glenn's expression shift from confusion to barely concealed panic as the inspector handed him a citation. A few moments later, a second official arrived, this one from the zoning office. By the time Robert left, Glenn was standing in his yard, red-faced and shouting into his phone, while a team of county workers marked off areas for removal. Robert whistled as he walked away. The first strike had landed. The battle escalates. The next week was chaos. News of Glenn's violations spread quickly through the Oak Ridge community. Whispers turned into open conversations. Homeowners, many of whom had been crushed under HOA fines for minor infractions, grass that was an inch too tall, a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige, began questioning why Glenn himself had been allowed to break the rules. Janet Walker, Robert's longtime neighbor, was the first to reach out. She met him at the fence line between their properties, arms crossed, a knowing look in her eye. "That was you, wasn't it?" she asked. Robert shrugged. "Just playing by their rules." She smirked. "Good. Because people are fed up." Janet wasn't alone. Over the next few days, more homeowners started coming forward, people who had been hit with excessive fines, forced to make expensive changes, or threatened with legal action for minor infractions. Robert listened to their grievances, taking notes, collecting documents. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, they were ready. The meeting. The Oak Ridge HOA met once a month in the neighborhood clubhouse, a lavish space that looked more like a country club than a community center. That night, it was packed. Dozens of homeowners showed up, many who had never attended before. Glenn stood at the podium, his usual arrogance dimmed by the weight of recent events. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "I understand there have been concerns regarding recent enforcement actions," he said. "Rest assured, the HOA remains committed to maintaining the integrity of our community." Robert stood. "Is that so?" All eyes turned to him. Glenn's smile faltered. Robert stepped forward, holding up a thick stack of papers. "Because according to these records, you've been running this HOA like a personal fiefdom. Selective enforcement, misappropriated funds, unapproved projects. Should I go on?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Glenn's face darkened. "This is out of order, Calloway." "No, Glenn," Janet interjected, standing beside Robert. "What's out of order is how you've been running this place. We've been fined for flower pots and lawn chairs while you've been building whatever the hell you want." More voices joined in. Accusations flew. Glenn tried to regain control, but it was too late. The room had turned against him. That night, The HOA board voted to conduct a formal audit of its finances. Glenn stormed out before the vote was even finished. Robert watched him go, satisfaction settling deep in his chest. This was only the beginning. Glenn Whitmore had spent years ruling Oak Ridge like a king, issuing fines and threats with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. But kings only remained in power as long as their subjects stayed afraid. And fear was beginning to evaporate. Cracks in the foundation. Robert Calloway stood at the fence line of his farm, arms folded, watching as the latest HOA bulletin made its rounds. Janet Walker walked up beside him, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips as she held up a crisp white paper. "Glenn's scrambling," she said, shaking the notice. "They're reviewing HOA policies to ensure fairness." Robert huffed. Fairness? That man wouldn't know fairness if it bit him. The bulletin was Glenn's weak attempt to calm the storm. But it was too late for that. The audit was underway, the board was divided, and the once loyal residents of Oak Ridge were beginning to ask questions Glenn couldn't answer. Then came the lawsuits. Robert had expected the homeowners to be angry. He hadn't expected them to organize. Within days of the last HOA meeting, a group of residents filed formal complaints with the county. Others began digging into Glenn's past decisions, uncovering years of dubious financial records and misappropriated funds. Some fines issued by the HOA hadn't been properly documented. Others had been mysteriously inflated. And at the center of it all, Glenn Whitmore. Robert could see the pressure closing in, brick by brick, like a dam about to break. And then it did. The fall of a tyrant. It started with an emergency board meeting, one that Glenn hadn't called. For years, Glenn had controlled Oak Ridge's HOA board through intimidation and backdoor deals. But now, the same people he had handpicked were turning against him. Janet called Robert that night, voice practically crackling with excitement. They just voted to strip Glenn of his executive authority. Robert leaned back in his chair, a slow grin forming. About time. They're calling a full community vote next month to remove him entirely. Robert had seen it coming. Once people stopped being afraid, Glenn had nothing left to hold them in place. Still, Glenn wasn't the type to go down quietly. The very next day, HOA members found a mass email in their inboxes, a desperate plea from Glenn himself. He painted himself as a victim, claimed Robert and his allies were spreading lies, and warned that if they ousted him, Oak Ridge would fall into chaos. It was the last gasp of a drowning man. Robert read the email twice, shaking his head. Glenn still believed he could win by fear. But he was about to learn what happened when people had nothing left to fear. The night of the community vote arrived, and the Oak Ridge clubhouse was packed. Residents lined the walls, some clutching years' worth of unjust fines, others murmuring amongst themselves. Glenn sat at the front, jaw tight, watching as people filed in. Robert stood near the back, arms crossed. He had no speech prepared, no grand statement to make. He didn't need to. The people were ready to speak for themselves. One by one, they stood and told their stories. The woman who had been fined for painting her door the wrong shade of blue. The elderly man forced to remove a wheelchair ramp because it wasn't aesthetically approved. Families drained by endless fees. Neighbors punished for rules Glenn himself had never followed. By the time the votes were cast, Glenn already knew the result. His face was pale, his fingers gripping the table in front of him. When the final count was announced, the room erupted. Glenn Whitmore had been removed as president of the Oak Ridge HOA. The king had been dethroned. One last reckoning. Robert expected Glenn to fight it, to take it to court, to claw at any scrap of power he had left. Instead, Glenn vanished. Within a week, the for sale sign was up in front of his pristine, rule-compliant house. The man who had spent years dictating how others lived had been run out by his own kingdom. The audit findings were damning. Thousands of dollars misused, fraudulent charges, even personal expenses hidden within HOA budgets. Glenn was facing financial ruin, and by the time the dust settled, Oak Ridge was no longer his to control. Robert stood at his fence again, watching as movers carried furniture from Glenn's house. Janet joined him, sipping from a thermos of coffee. "So, she said, tilting her head. What's next? Robert let out a slow breath. The bridge, he said. I'm getting my damn bridge back. Glenn Whitmore had spent years bending the rules in his favor, believing himself untouchable. But when the dust settled, he was nothing more than a disgraced man with a for sale sign in his yard. The kingdom he built had crumbled. And Robert Calloway wasn't finished yet. The last act. Oak Ridge was still reeling in the weeks after Glenn's removal. The new HOA board was scrambling to clean up the mess he had left behind, correcting unlawful fines, issuing refunds where possible, and working to repair the HOA's fractured reputation. For many, it was a victory. For Robert, it was unfinished business. One evening, as the sun dipped low over his farmland, he found himself staring at the creek. The space where his bridge had once stood was still bare, the land scarred from where it had been torn away. He hadn't fought this long just to leave things undone. So he did what his family had always done. He built. With the help of a few neighbors, people who had once been strangers but were now allies, Robert designed a new bridge. Stronger than the last. Better. He didn't ask the HOA for permission. Instead, he sent them a notice, a formal acknowledgement that he was reinstating access to his land, citing the same county regulations Glenn had once twisted for his own gain. The same laws that had torn his bridge down now protected his right to rebuild it. The HOA had no grounds to stop him. The day the last beam was secured, Janet Walker stood beside him, watching as Robert tested the weight with a satisfied nod. Never thought I'd see the day someone outplayed Glenn Whitmore, she said. Robert smirked. Guess he forgot. Farmers don't back down. A new order. The Oak Ridge community changed after Glenn's fall. The HOA still existed, but it no longer ruled through intimidation. Rules were revised, policy softened. The iron grip that had once controlled the neighborhood was gone, replaced by something fairer, something that made people feel like homeowners instead of tenants under a tyrant. And Robert? He went back to his farm. But his fight had left a mark, not just on Oak Ridge, but on the people within it. He had proven that no one was above the rules, not even those who wrote them. One evening, as he crossed his new bridge, the wooden beams firm beneath his boots, Robert allowed himself a small smile. They had tried to take his land, his freedom. Instead, he had taken their empire.